Welcome
to Group 4
Quaranphysics demonstration.
We will show you the demonstration of different applications of laws of motion. But first, let us know who discovered the 3 laws of motion. Isaac Newton was an English mathematician, physicist, astronomer, theologian, and most influential scientist who discovered the 3 laws of motion, namely the law of inertia, law of acceleration, and law of interaction. So what are the differences of 3 laws of motion?
Law of inertia, also known as first law of motion, states that every object will retain its states of motion, whether at rest or moving with a constant velocity in a straight line, unless acted upon by a net force.
Law of acceleration, also known as the second law of motion, states that the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the net force acting on it. It's the same direction as the net force and is inversely proportional to its mass.
Law of interaction, also known as third law of motion. It states that for every action, there is an equal magnitude in opposite direction that explains how objects interact with each other in terms of forces.
Accidentally hitting the bottle is an example of the first law of motion. The bottle did not move until an external force was applied by my hand.
Bowling. Bowling is a sport and it is an example of the first law of motion, where you throw a heavy ball to make the pins fall down and win with a strike. As we know, the ball will not move unless you exert force on it.
Switching of the fan is an example of first law of motion. When the fan is switched off, the fan does not come to rest immediately as there is still rotational inertia that acts on the fan which keeps on moving.
Pulling a baggage is an example of the second law of motion. The more the mass of the object, the slower the acceleration will be. So for our example, the mass of the baggage is heavy. The acceleration of that is slower than a baggage with less mass. It is because mass affects acceleration.
Switching light is one example of applied force and belongs to the second law of motion. When we say applied force, it is a force that is exerted by one object on one or more objects. By simply applying force or power to switch the light, the applied force is present.
Pushing the chair is one example of applied force and belongs to the second law of motion, because I applied some force or power to move or push the backs. If this push or pull is exerted by one object to another, it becomes applied force by the previous object.
Tug of war is an example of tension force or a contact force, and it belongs to the third law of motion because a single rope is being pulled by 2 people or teams from the opposite ends. When we say tension force, it is the pulling force transmitted transversely by means of a rope, string, cable, and more.
Jumping is an example of the third law of motion. As you jump, you are exerting a force downward to the floor, and the floor exerting a force upward. Just like in here, our example, you are pushing down and the floor push you up.
Book on the table is an example of normal force or a contact force and belongs to Newton's third law of motion because it predicts that force on the platform with an equal and opposite force by simply stating that the normal force is acting on the object by the table and the normal force is acting on the table by the object. It's equal in magnitude to the weight of the book. There are 2 essential forces acting on the book: gravity or the weight pulling down and the force by the table pushing upwards.
Trivia, did you know that Isaac Newton has 2 birthdays? Despite of being born on January 4, he was also born on Christmas Day. It's confusing, right? At the time of his birth, the Gregorian calendar hadn't been adopted by England yet, because England was in the midst of 150-year period of using different calendar from the rest of Europe. Records indicate that he was born on Christmas Day and baptized on New Year's Day. When the Gregorian calendar was finally adopted by England, it needed to be adjusted by 11 days. So they decided that January 4 was Isaac Newton's birthday.